Hi, Misha here, and covered several Star Wars ships, but they've all been either Rebel, Imperial, or from the Republic. Well, let's change that today and to start talking about some of the Starfighters from the Confederation of Independent Systems, the C.I.S., the Separatists. And so we have 4 droid craft here. We have 2 versions of the Vulture Droid. One from Hot Wheels, one from the old Titanium. Then we have a late Titanium, which is a Hyena light bomber. And then finally, we have the droid Tri-Fighter. And these are all kind of based on the same concept. Nearly a disposable fighter. They're all controlled by the integrated droid brain. No shields, no hyperdrive, no cargo capacity. But very maneuverable, reasonably fast, very affordable to mass produce, and actually very heavily armed and very versatile for what they are. In fact, all but the Tri-Fighter can operate on the ground as a walker unit, an infantry unit too, although they're more at home in the stars. And these would be carried on board Confederate battleships, as well as put into kind of defensive pods, like satellite pods, where they could swarm out. And yeah, much as the Grand Army of the Republic and the Republic Navy used clones, which were essentially mass-grown, the Separatists used droid fighters that were mass-produced. But believe it or not, it was actually to a very high standard, at least in some aspects. So with that, let's take a closer look at each of these. Well, the official name for this is the Variable Geometry Droid Fighter, but it's just called the Vulture Mark 1. And this is the base model. It was tested around 34 BBY, and then was used in a few skirmishes against pirates and others that the Trade Federation deemed a threat. So after a few little provings, the first mass deployment was in 32 BBY during the blockade and eventual siege of Naboo, where they would eventually occupy the city. And at this time, yeah, they're controlled by the Trade Federation, and they're controlled by a central converted battleship, basically one of those big donuts. So they really don't have much autonomy. They were fast and maneuverable, but frankly pretty stupid. The Trade Federation version had 4 laser cannon and 2 quote-unquote energy torpedo launchers. And it could fly in atmosphere space, had a top speed in atmosphere of about 1,180 kph. And it could also flip around and walk on the ground using kind of the tips of its wings. It was just under 7 meters long, and when the wings were open like this, about 3 meters. When they were closed like this, it was less than 2 meters, so very thin target. And interestingly, it used solid fuel cell pellets to make it go. While it could only have intensive combat for a short period of time, it could be on standby for a couple of days before needing to go back and recharge. So relatively versatile. In space, these are used as interceptors, escorts, guards, and on the ground as a walker, they were used again as guards, reconnaissance, patrol, what have you. So they could do a lot of roles, but they weren't especially great at them. But they were relatively cheap to produce. In fact, they were about 18 to 19,000 credits at a time when most, even simplistic starfighters were 3 times that. But again, this time they couldn't operate independently. And the Trade Federation versions were kind of more in a brown scheme. They would go to the more kind of blue type scheme when they entered into the Confederation, the C.I.S. service. So like I said, this one is from Hot Wheels. It's actually one of their later releases, I think 2017 or 19. It has the newer style clear acrylic stand. And it's a pretty nice little model. The center is metal. The wings are polymer plastic. And it gets dropped. And it nothing moves. It's just a fixed piece. Now this one is the titanium, and actually this mold dates all the way back to 1999 in the Phantom Menace. It's all metal, including the wings, and they do open, although not always smoothly. Let's see if I can do it here. With the 4 moving parts, what you tend to run into with these is some are a little loose and some are a little stiff. Come on. And this side's a little bit so. There we go. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's neat that they do articulate. It's not the same at all, but it's kind of a nod to the later X-Wings and other fighters that have the S-foils that open up. And that was the idea. It would cruise around with these closed for efficiency and to protect systems, but then could open them up to spread out the firing arcs, because the cannon would be located on these tips, and then you had additional ordnance inside there. And you can fold these in to make them more secure. But really, I like to just leave the titanium closed. It locks in a nice closed position and looks good. Also, because these are metal, they're a little bit thick per scale. Whereas since these are plastic, the wings / legs are more correct. Otherwise, they're about the same scale. The only downside really to this one is that it does have the screw holes in the bottom. But like I said, these were tested briefly before Naboo, and then used there. At first, they were used kind of in conjunction with the organic fleets by the Trade Federation, and they joined the Confederate systems with the Battle of Geonosis, and would be the mainstay of the fleet. Inexpensive. They would get some upgrades during the Clone Wars. They would go from obviously needing a control ship to being autonomous, although with still relatively limited programming. They would have a few variants with more advanced brains in them, but yeah. Also, during the Clone Wars, some would be outfitted with alternative missile launchers carrying up to 6 medium concussion missiles, and even having a Buzz Droid launcher missile. They would even increase the laser cannons from 4 to 6, and the additional 2 give it more firepower on the ground and in space, which was good. So they did update these. They also started to be manufactured by a few different firms, not just the original one who made these for the Trade Federation. And it's if it looks insectoid, that's because it is. It was based off kind of a carapace thing. And these would serve through the Clone War, being shut down, although they would pop up from time to time in the hands of dissidents, rebels, pirates, gangsters. Even a few obtained autonomy and kind of did their own thing. I guess, Vulture Droid rights, huh? And they still were around before the Battle of Yavin. And even would pop up from time to time afterwards. But by that point, they're quite dated technology. But they were quite advanced technology when introduced 30 years earlier. But production was long over. For the real world, this was originally designed to be piloted by a B-1 battle droid. Hence why we have kind of a cockpit back here. But they decided to make these autonomous. And this became more of a area for the droid brain, if you will. And again, just the iconic Trade Federation Separatist fighter. And they could produce a lot of these. In fact, a standard battleship would have about 1,500 on board, with specialty ships having more, and even smaller frigates able to carry dozens, if not hundreds. Because, when compacted down, they're very thin. You can get several stacked on a deck. And again, they can double as a walker to kind of serve 2 roles. And they would inspire our next craft, the Hyena light bomber. And as you can see, it definitely does resemble the Vulture. They just made the body wider, longer, and stronger. Whereas the Vulture was designed to be an interceptor fighter. Our Hyena here was designed to be a light bomber that could double as a starfighter in a pinch. This is from the titanium, but it's actually a late titanium. And you'll notice they went to the fixed wings on it too, so I think they realized that having those articulated parts is just asking for trouble. You don't see many of these because this came out at the end of the line. This was actually first seen not in the prequel films, but the Clone Wars series. So what do we have here? Well, front to back, we're a little bit longer, at about 12.5 meters. Remember, the regular Vulture is about 7. We're a little bit taller. The regular Vulture was under 2 meters. This is getting close to 3.5 meters tall. But it's still quite small. And it's still reasonably fast. It can get up to 1,150 kph in an atmosphere. So only 30 or so kilometers slower than the standard Vulture. In other ways, it's very similar. It still has about 2 days worth of power. It still uses fuel pellets, solid fuel pellets. But yeah, it's designed as a bomber. That's why we have 2 modules here. And we have 2 quad laser guns instead of 4 or 6 standard. That's because this isn't intended to be a fighter, but it needed something for self-defense. Rather, it had 2 ordnance launchers, and it could carry 6 proton torpedoes. It could also carry full-size concussion missiles. I don't think it could carry heavier ordnance, but a proton torpedo is still pretty powerful at this day and time. And they were very maneuverable, because again, there's no organic on board to turn it into goo. But the droid brain was somewhat limited. And it too could be made into a walker. In fact, these would kind of fold in a more interesting pattern when landing, making it a little taller and more intimidating on the ground. And yeah, these would not be available at the beginning of the Clone Wars, the Battle of Geonosis, but they would start to appear a short time later at the Battle of Christophsis, or whatever it is, about 6 months later. This was kind of their first big debut. They did well as a bomber variant, and so they were ordered into widespread production. So by 21 BBY, they were quite a common and feared opponent, so much so that they were a prime target. They were good at attacking space things, battleships, capital ships, as well as ground targets. They had a little bit more advanced sensors than a regular Vulture. Vulture just has pretty standard short-range sensors. These had a 3-sensor arrangement system. Still relatively short-range, but a little more precise. And they too could be carried on your regular battleships or put in defensive pods to protect against Venator Star Destroyers. They never would produce these in huge numbers like the Vultures, but they were still a relatively common sight. So, maybe like a 1-to-20 ratio. But not bad, because it is a specialist craft. Now, like I said, these were not in the prequel films. They were in the Clone Wars miniseries, or no, animated series. So I didn't actually even know about the hyena here till later. But it's neat. It definitely is a Vulture, but it's nice to kind of see an expansion of the C.I.S. Navy. And there's a couple of different minor versions of these. But again, they came out so late that most of your lines didn't do it. I'm actually just happy that the titanium got to it. And this one is all metal, including the wings, like the original. But as I said, they don't move, which is okay. Nice and sturdy feel to them. The funny thing is, just to bring that up, again, this is not quite double the size. Let's knock that over. It's not quite double the size of the standard Vulture, but actually the figurine here is seemingly smaller. Yeah. This is something you kind of notice with the late titaniums. I think they were kind of saving material. They were also going more towards models and less towards toys at this time. So even though some of the late ones are more detailed, they are smaller. But yeah, it goes really well to give them a light bomber that has a secondary role as a fighter. And that leads right into our final one here, the Tri-Fighter. This was actually the smallest fighter, not only in the C.I.S. Navy, but also the Navy of the Republic. It was under 5.5 meters long and under 3.5 meters wide / tall. And in some ways, it wasn't even that expensive for what it was. It was designed as a dedicated dogfighter, so-called heavy starfighter. And it wasn't available till relatively late in the Clone Wars. So what do we have here? Well, obviously it has a tri design, hence the name Tri-Fighter, Starfighter, Droid, Tri-Fighter, what have you. It has 3 engines in the back, and it has this gyro stabilized thing in the middle, this kind of bulb, which is where the droid brain is. Now, it doesn't have shields, just like the rest, and it's actually the slowest. It's only about 1,050 kph, so about 100 slower than the Hyena. It doesn't have especially better armor. So, why is this better? Why was this a threat? A couple of things. One, the droid brain in here was considered an advanced one with advanced programming. It was designed to be what they call a predator, and it had learning ability to analyze, anticipate, and either mimic, predict, outthink the clone pilots. Not so good against Jedi, but since clones themselves are a bit predictable, yeah, it was a pretty even match. A much more intelligent brain in here. It also had a lot of ordnance going on. There are 3 light laser cannons, one on each wing, with a 4th heavy laser cannon smack dab in the middle. And if that's not enough, they are on tilting rails, sliding rails. They can gimbal a bit, not an awful lot, but just enough to try to hit a target. And if that's still not enough for you, each of these wings can house either 2 concussion missiles or 1 proton torpedo. So either 6 concussion missiles or 3 proton torpedoes on board. And if that's still not enough, externally on the bottom, you can mount 2 Buzz Droid Discord missiles. These could be fired when they got close to a target. They would, well, disgorge the little Buzz Droids. So this thing was armed up for its size. And the idea with this little spinny thing, it could remain stationary, stable, allowing this to flip around and roll around, either to give it a better firing arc or just to kind of disorientate the opponent. And its small size was much to its advantage. And they weren't all that expensive either. As I said, the original Vulture, 18,000, 19,000 credits. The Hyena was a bit more, as you'd expect, about 23,000. The little Tri-Fighter here was actually in the middle there. It could be as much as 40,000, all decked out with all the ordnance. But if you had a stripped down version, maybe didn't have the Buzz Droid missiles, and some of them only had one central laser, they were as low as 20,000. So not a whole lot more than a Vulture. Even the stripped down ones, you still had the more intelligent brain box. Yeah, but they started testing these about 21 BBY. There were some small field tests and skirmishes, but the first major use of these was around 20 BBY. And when they were used against capital ships like Venator Star Destroyers. And they were, of course, made famous by their role in the battle over Coruscant at 19 BBY. These were used to make a defensive screen against the invisible hand, but they were also sent down into the city of Coruscant just to raise hell. And even after the Separatists withdrew, many of these were left behind and gave clones headaches to try to mop them up. One thing to say, they had a longer range than a lot of other droid fighters, and because of their brain, they had more autonomy, more independence. They're just sneakier. Interesting thing from the real world, George Lucas originally conceived this as something to be shot out of a carrier type vessel, like the Invisible Hand, kind of like a bullet. And then they would have booster rockets strapped on the back, kind of like how the Jedi fighters had the hyperdrive rings. And that would get them to their target quickly, kind of making up for their somewhat slow speed. And then they would detach the boosters once the fuel was exhausted or they got to their target, keeping them small and agile. This didn't happen just because the CGI battle over Coruscant was already massive, and having ships ejecting parts and doing things was felt to be too confusing, but neat concept nevertheless. Kind of explains the less conventional shape here. But like the other droid craft, these were shut down after the war was over. But actually in 15 BBY, production was briefly started up again by a rogue Geonosian who found his way to Mustafar, found a factory, got it running, and that gave the 501st Legion and Mr. Darth Vader some target practice. So there was a limited production run of Tri-Fighters, and they were respected enough that many were used well before the Battle of Yavin by various terrorist, separatist, resistance cells. And they were still kind of knocking about the galaxy during the Galactic Civil War, being used by security firms and whatnot. And they were in several museums. They were a bit of a sought-after piece, because this was kind of the ultimate droid fighter from the war, featuring just a lot of ordnance packed into a small package, and the best brain they came up with. Really, its only major shortcoming was its lack of speed, but it still had maneuverability, and you could get a lot of these on a ship because of how small they were. It's also my favorite. I do like that the little toy model here does articulate, and this is all metal, except for, of course, the detailing, cannons and stuff being plastic. It's a good size, too. Even though it's the smallest, it's actually the largest. And these are actually pretty hard to find today. This one came out in a gift set when the Revenge of the Sith was out. That's when these were first seen, I believe, in episode 3. So yeah, I'm just kind of having a relaxed look at the droid brain fighters. So I told you my favorite. Which one do you like? I have to admit, the Separatist navies, I like it, but yeah, I like the Republic more and all that. But they're still neat, and I like the concept. You know, if you look at the original trilogy, it's Rebels versus Empire, you know, people versus people. Maybe the little guy versus the big guy, but pretty straightforward. The Clone Wars is very interesting from a sociological and military point of view, because both sides created armies, created navies, and while the Republic grew theirs, but they grew them at an accelerated rate, let's not forget that they had 9 and 10-year-olds fighting, even with the accelerated growth rate. And they were essentially slaves. Let's be honest, they didn't have any choice. They couldn't say, nah, I don't want to fight. They were fighting. And much the same in the Separatists. These droids, especially later on with the Tri-Fighter, had some level of self-awareness, and they were put together in factories, and that was their goal, that was their purpose. And both sides kind of viewed these assets as disposable. They weren't unique, be it the clones or the vultures. And it's interesting to think of fighting a battle that way. So yeah, I think that's what's good about the prequels. The concept, the setting, the world is really interesting. It takes what was set up in the original trilogy and expands it. Of course, the flip side is characters, dialogue, all that. Maybe not as good as the original, but hey, nothing's perfect. And that's why, even if it's not always my favorite, I still like having stuff from the prequels. I even have some stuff from the sequels. Hey, I like some of the ship designs, what can I say? Some of them, not all of them. But yeah, I just haven't really talked about the Separatists and felt like correcting that tonight. And this is kind of part 1. In the next part, we'll look at the piloted vehicles they had, because yeah, it wasn't just all droid fighters. They did have some with pilots, but that's for next time. Anyway, feel free to comment below. Let me know which ones you like. Again, the Tri is my favorite. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.